The Wrinkle. And today we have again our special guest, Natalie Wilton. So thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me.
Natalie is a sex therapist and social worker who works for a provincial program helping seniors who are living with dementia. But she also has a private practice where she helps people with their needs in terms of sex therapy. Now, this is part 3 in our series of sex and seniors, and today's topic is a little bit more complex. We're going to talk about sex and seniors and brain changes. It seems that the nomenclature surrounding sexuality as it relates to those with cognitive impairment or dementia is also negative and usually linked with the term inappropriate or some other negative connotation. So the question becomes, where is the line? Where does sexual expression go from a need to a disinhibition to a behavior, aka problem? What happens when an action happens with no malintent but occurs in the wrong context? Is it fair to label it a behavior, or is it more an expression of a need? So Natalie, you're a professional in this area, so what does the literature tell us about this?
Well, the literature tells us that even with or without dementia, most older adults subscribe to at least a moderate importance to sexuality and sexual activities, whether that's holding hands, kissing, hugging, intercourse, use of pornography, anything. We are sexual beings as we age.
So, that makes sense, right? We don't sort of think about that. When I'm seeing people with dementia thinking about their perceptions of sex and sexuality, that's not usually top of my mind. But scientifically, we know that that's true.
Yeah. The World Health Organization recognizes healthy sexuality as a right and a basic human need that exists throughout the lifespan. And other research finding has shown that even residents in nursing homes at least report sexual desire in similar proportions to those of their community dwelling counterparts as well.
That's interesting because when you go to a long-term care home or a nursing home, it's not set up to have a sex life, right? Like a lot of people have roommates. And okay, a lot of young people have roommates too, but you don't even sometimes have a lock on your door. So people are thinking about sex in long-term care, but we haven't really accommodated that, right, by designing it.
Exactly.
So preparing for this talk, I thought, okay, I'm going to look at sex and dementia or sex in long-term care. And just doing a quick search, some of what came up was negative. So some of it was like sexual assault in long-term care, or it was about residents being sexually inappropriate with other residents or with care partners. There is that negative stigma or negative association.
Yeah, there really is. And it's about trying to figure out when we look at behavior, when something is labeled a behavior or an expression, is it something that what we might call hypersexuality? Is it that negative, predatory, abusive type behavior, or is it something else? Is it dementia? Is it looking for human touch? And trying to tease out where it actually fits.
Okay, so let's take a step back then. Let's talk about the positive side, the normal side of being a sexual being and being a senior, and maybe even being a senior with cognitive impairment.
Well, if we think of ourselves all as sexual beings, we all have a sexual persona, if you will. So we have preferences. We have a sexual orientation. We have values, and we have beliefs about how we feel about sex and what our sex life has been like throughout our entire lives. And sometimes that's something that's very public, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes we present ourselves publicly as heterosexual, but maybe we actually fit somewhere else along the spectrum. And I think that's important to recognize, especially in care settings, is there tends to be a bias in care settings for heterosexual. We sort of see that as normal and anything else is abnormal, which is completely wrong, but we tend to look towards that. There's other things. What kind of personality did you have? So were you a flirtatious person? Were you the kind of person that said how beautiful the cashier at the grocery store looked every time you saw them? Were you the type of person that would flirt with every guy that walked by? those are what could be normal for somebody. Even looking at things like your culture and your cohort. So when I mean by that, I don't just mean your ethnic culture, and that could have a play in it, but I also mean where you grew up. So even something like if you grew up in an era where whistling at a pretty girl was appropriate or normal. I have a friend who loves Frank Sinatra and was showing me a Frank Sinatra biography, and one of the chapters was wooing and surviving broads. We would never say that today, ever. And we know that is so inappropriate. But at one time, that was normal. So we need to, when we see quote unquote behaviors or expressions, we need to think about where that's coming from.
Even that term wooing, that's a bit of a tip off.
Exactly. Even things like gender roles. I was listening to a piece about sexuality a little while ago, and they were talking about how women of a certain generation felt obligation about sex, and they had sex because they felt obligated to. So those gender roles, those cultural roles, those, what generation you were born in really dictate maybe what your view is on sexuality. And it's important to filter all your, when you're analyzing a behavior or an expression, you filter it through that lens.
So does that mean that we should excuse some of those behaviors? I mean, so if you're from the Frank Sinatra generation, you might be inclined to call someone honey or sweetie or a broad or something like that. But does that mean we should give people a pass for doing those things?
I think what we need to do is give them understanding. Right? Understand where that's coming from, and understand that if they have dementia, they may not understand the time and place that they're in, and may not understand that right now we live in, the quote unquote Me Too generation, where that is completely inappropriate to say. I think we just need to provide that understanding that that's the information they have to pull on.
So putting it in context, maybe that would allow you to be a bit understanding or cut them some slack or just interpret it through that different lens.
That's right? Exactly.
Okay, so that's just things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, right? The differences and where we're coming from and all of that. What about how that changes, though, if we throw cognitive impairment in there? So how does cognitive impairment change a person's sexual expression?
Well, cognitive impairment changes sexual expression in a lot of ways. And basically, to me, the rule of thumb is when we see a sexual expression and we know the person has dementia, the first thing we need to be looking at is how are the brain changes that we're seeing in this person affecting the way this expression is appearing.
Okay, like what? When I think of dementia, so some of the education I would do would be saying, well, the symptoms are, we always think of forgetfulness, but then there's other symptoms and we call them by the letter A. Amnesia, that's the forgetting, and then aphasia and apraxia. So, let's think about that. So how would the amnesia part, how would the memory change part affect sexual expression?
Well, you might not remember who your partner is. You may not remember that you're married. You may think that you are a much younger person than you are. You may think you're in your 20s when you're really in your 80s.
And because that's one thing I've noticed too, is that no matter how old someone gets, they're still attracted to a similar age group.
That's right.
Right? Everybody can appreciate a very attractive looking person who's in their 20s or 30s. Yeah. Okay, so the forgetting, you might then choose an inappropriate time, place, person.
Exactly.
Because you've forgotten some of those other aspects of your life.
Right.
Okay.
Even an altered perception. So that's one of the A's. So thinking about the way our visual acuity changes. It shrinks to sort of that binocular, smaller field of vision. So if you do that, if you kind of make binoculars over your eyes, you can see that where you're looking may be at someone's genitals, so the person who's providing care for you, and your reach tends to go in the same field as your vision, so maybe that's what you're reaching for. Even the lack of empathy and understanding that comes with brain changes, when you become that more self-centered person, you don't appreciate how what you're saying or doing is affecting other people.
Okay. Fair enough. And now you mentioned, so that just painted a picture in my mind of the care partner. Maybe it's a professional care partner, right? In that kind of setting. And that's interesting too, because when I told one of my colleagues who's a physician that we were going to do this piece on sex and seniors, and I didn't say which part of the series we were doing, but I just said, we're going to talk about sex and seniors. And this person said, well, are you going to tell PSWs how they can protect themselves from sexual advances? So right away, that thought process went to this negative interaction and how a PSW needs protection from a senior. So very, very negative. But when you mentioned, hey, it just could be the perspective, the actual physical perspective of what you can see and how you can coordinate your limbs, that you may not need protection so much as strategies for redirection.
Right.
Or avoiding those things.
Exactly. And an interpretation of the space that you're in. So, for example, if you are in a care facilities or even at home and a care worker is coming in to provide you something like a bath, if you don't think that you need that, because people with dementia don't know they don't know, they don't think that they have a problem.
Anosognosia.
That's right. Yeah. And when someone comes in to provide them a shower and ask them to take their clothes off, and they think they're 20 years old, they think that they're at a courting age, they think they're looking for a partner. If someone came in and asked you to take your clothes off, what might you think? Right? It could be arousing.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we've talked about a lot that people with dementia lose their filter. That's one of the first things to go. And one of the most common symptoms that people report all the time is people say the wrong thing at the wrong time. And for whatever reason, the way our brain changes with dementia, our swear jars seem to stay intact. Right? And
that's true.
All that language, that sexual language, swear words, all that, that pathway to our brains seems to still be readily available. Yeah. So those words come out.
And we call it disinhibition,
exactly.
So that normally you'd be inhibited by whatever, your frontal lobes or your recall or just your awareness of the situation. But when you're disinhibited, that stuff is going to come out. Possibly in mixed company. So, Natalie, maybe you can give me some examples of situations that you've seen where a person's sexual expression has changed because of the changes of their brain.
Two that really stand out for me. One, I have a fellow who lives in a retirement home, and he was the type of person that would walk out into public areas with very little to no clothes on.
Oh, no.
And so he was a large man and sort of very imposing. And he also, talking back about the filter, a lack of sort of that public language, he used a lot of swear words and sex talk because that's how he presented with his dementia. So you can guess that the staff felt very overwhelmed and took exception to that. Yeah. But when we looked at it and we analyzed it a little bit further, he's the type of person that typically would run hot. Like, he's always hot. So at home, he didn't wear very many clothes. It was pants optional because that's what he did at his home. So we spent a lot of time and energy explaining to this man, this is his home. He must live here. Get used to it. Now this is your home. And now we're telling him he can't do what he would normally do in his home. So that's a pretty simple example of something that on the surface, he was really framed as that sexual predator in the situation. But when we analyzed it a little bit deeper, he wasn't. The other piece about this gentleman too, he had a very loving and special relationship with his wife. So sex and love and intimacy was very important to him. So when he expressed those needs, it's something he was missing because his wife had been passed away for a number of years. Aww. So it was a loss for him too. Yeah. And then when you filter that in with dementia and not understanding necessarily the right place or time, it makes more sense.
Yeah,
It's not what we originally pictured it as. Another example, I had a fellow in a retirement home, and he walked into several female residents' rooms grasping his penis. And so they thought, naturally, that he was there to
use that penis.
Yep, he was trying to expose himself to him. And they were scared. And that's, again, when we looked a little bit more at the situation and dug a little bit deeper, we saw, he usually had urinated himself, so he was probably trying to find a bathroom and couldn't find a bathroom. When we look at his environment, he was walking down a hallway that 20 doors that look very similar to his.
Yes.
So his environmental cues he couldn't interpret. And of the 20 rooms, 15 of them, and 5 of which were right near his room, were at least all females. So,
which is common in long-term care or any,
And so, but the law of probability would say he's more likely to go into a female room.
Yeah.
All female rooms around him. So he wasn't trying to be lecherous or expose himself to people. He had to go to the bathroom. He couldn't find his room, and he just didn't know how to express himself.
Yeah. And so that comes to people's attention as inappropriate or predatory sexual behavior.
Exactly.
So it's all about the context, right?
Exactly.
Like finding the context, understanding the person,
right,
where they came from, and now where they are now.
Yes.
Where they are mentally now, too. Because dementia can sort of change a person's perception, ability to problem solve, ability to use language to express things. So you might use more of a physical gesture to that part of the body or touch that part of the body.
That's right.
Did you reach a compromise with those situations? Like
we were
able to sort
through them and reach a compromise through those situations. But it's really that lesson about digging a little bit deeper and finding out about the person and seeing if we can apply the dementia lens to it before we apply other things to it. And what the actual needs are and intent behind that behavior.
And then there are the people who, when you were describing what you were like before, I thought of the huggers.
Yes.
You know, the people who are the huggers.
Yep.
Some people just are. I know even in my practice, there's some people that just want to give a hug, and, you know, oftentimes that's okay.
Right. That's what's normal
but
for them.
It's normal for them. Yeah. And sometimes you'll see the partner kind of being apologetic about that too, but that's just who they are. And now we're sort of referring to some terms here, but you've made a really nice diagram as well, which we'll share with all of the listeners, but it shows how the things that do inform sexual expression. So we're kind of talking about the brain changes due to dementia and how they kind of impact on the things you mentioned, the retained persona, person's background, their preferences, their cohort, their age, and so on. Also on this pyramid here, you've got human interaction behaviors. So what exactly are those? Can you define that a bit more for us?
Sure. So it's quite possible that when we see sexual expression, what we're actually seeing is someone looking for human interaction. So maybe they're just looking to have touch from someone. People with dementia tend to lack that affectionate touch, right? They're tending to get more of that instrumental care touch. They're getting their care from care providers who, for good reasons, are not allowed to provide intimate touch to the person that they're caring for. So they really have a real lack of that human love, affection, touch that maybe they're so used to receiving. So maybe they're looking for reassurance. Maybe they're looking just to hold someone's hands. They want proximity to people. They want that human touch. So even something like crawling into bed with a fellow resident, maybe that has very little to do with sex, but more to do with the fact that they've been used to sleeping in a bed with someone every night of their life for the past 60 years or even longer. You know, some people, I know when my mother grew up, she grew up living, you know, being in the same bed and bedroom as lots of people in big families, right?
Yeah.
So when people are used to that and when their brain tells them that's where they are, that's what they're seeking.
And that would be comforting, and it would be able to we'd be able to understand it. Right?
Yes.
We'd be able to understand the behaviors a little bit more. What about things like when you mentioned touch? I think about some of the changes that can happen in dementia can be a reflex. So some touch is a reflex, isn't it? Like a grab.
Yeah.
So some people have this reflex called the grasp reflex that we're born with. It's like when an infant grabs your finger, it's because they love you, but it's also because it's a reflex. Some of those reflexes can come back as the brain is aging and undergoing degenerative change. A grab could just be a reflex grab, something like that. So the touch could be, so it's very hard to interpret that. Now, when does sexual behavior cross that line? So what are some of the things that can happen with, and maybe happen more commonly with cognitive impairment or dementia? But when does a good thing kind of go bad?
So when we're talking more about hypersexuality, we're talking more about that indiscriminate behavior where they just can't stop being sexual. It's happening all the time. There's a lot of risk to other people. It's much more disinhibited than maybe a simple mistake kind of because of cognitive changes. This is more associated, I think, from more medical causes. So like a chemical like dopamine, as you know, it's linked to sex drive and sexual feelings and pleasure. So when there's some discrepancies there, that can cause changes in hypersexuality. We see it more in like that mania, those manic states where there's judgment errors.
And that's a really good point. And I think the term hyper, I mean, that's a medical term, right? And it really does mean out of the norm. Like it's not just that you're hyper because you're excited, but it's actual overdrive. And that is usually pretty easy to recognize. And part of that is that it's indiscriminate, like you say. So it might not just be going to try to initiate sexual contact with a favorite person, but with every person, or even, it all the time. Or sometimes it's compulsive masturbation is another behavior that's very, very hypersexual. And that's usually pretty easy to recognize as being a brain degeneration-driven symptom. So that's clearly a symptom of the dementia.
Exactly.
And we treat that differently too,
Yeah. And I think people tend to use that as a label right away when they're, when they see that, they're like, oh, the person's become hypersexual. And often they're not. What you're describing is something completely different than maybe what we're seeing, just simply because of dementia. Yeah,
they're normosexual, but it's at the wrong time.
Right.
And so it's seeming really hyper and out of the norm.
That's right.
And that is treated with, so a sex therapist might have a role if they're like you and they also have some experience in behavioral therapy interventions for someone with dementia. But usually medication is a part of that. And sometimes we use antidepressants. So you might think antidepressants would make people more hyper, but in the case of when it is truly an inappropriate sexual behavior, sometimes antidepressants help to dampen that down. Or hormones. We sometimes use hormones. And if it's a male person who is having some of the behavior, sometimes we use things to modulate the sex hormones. But that's for when it is this abnormal sort of medical hypersexuality. And it's important to distinguish that, eh?
It really is. Yeah. It really is. And then I think that sort of leads into the other misnomer, I guess, when people make the assumption of when someone with a sexual expression is being predatory or abusive, when they sort of make the assumption that they're being, lewd or lecherous. I think that really is something that people could be doing. There are people that are sexually abusive everywhere. It's quite possible that older people are. They certainly don't get a pass as not being sexually abusive because they're older, but I think that's a very small number of people, and people that tend to have had a pervasive pattern of rule violation of sexual deviance in the past. It wasn't just something that suddenly appeared through their dementia.
That's a tough one because, I've had a couple of surprises where somebody has had such a history that wasn't really disclosed.
Yes.
And it comes out when the person goes from living on their own to now living in community or living in a long-term care home or even just in hospital or some other place. But very rare.
It's rare.
Right?
And those kind of situations are about power and control. Abuse is a power over somebody and trying to use sex to control somebody. And I think we need to focus that there's risk there. And so we need to analyze each of these situations and really think about what the risk level is in all these situations. And are we looking at risk, or are we trying to make a value judgment on the situation?
That's a good point, because last episode that we had, or maybe it was the first one, we were sort of talking about sex. And when you're a senior and your sex life, for whatever reason, kind of comes to the attention of your adult children, and there's a conflict there, right? And there's sort of people might say it's inappropriate because it's a value judgment. A lot of times it is a value judgment. But then as soon as someone labels it as being a risk situation, then we start looking for medications or separating people or doing something. Are there any tools that you use to help navigate that, or any sort of ways of framing the discussion with people to help clarify that?
Yeah, there's some really good guidelines that do exist out there, and they can be found online. There's a one in Ontario called the Lanark, Leeds, and Grenville. Their Lynn they put together a really great policy, and it's got a really good risk tool assessment in there. So that can help because really what we want to determine is it possible that what we're seeing could...
I'm looking it up as you talk. Sorry.
could be... Could it be dementia? Could it be just seeking touch? Is it actually a riskier hypersexuality or predatory behavior? So we really want to tease out what it could be, like looking at all the symptoms, and then again, filter that back and forth through that retained sexual persona. So who is the person? We need to get a good sexual history on that person and understand what kind of person they are and were and what their preferences were, and really again think of that lens of where did they come from, what's their normal and their baseline. And I think there are lots of good policies that exist out there that you can use to try to determine what level of risk, who's at risk here, and how much risk is it an acceptable level of risk, or is it something that we need to do something about?
Well, thanks for bearing with me as I was typing in the midst of this podcast, but I just pulled up those guidelines. So that looks really good. It's a best practice approach to intimacy and sexuality. And they kind of start out with some value statements that sexuality is important and all of that. So that would be a good resource to share with our listeners too. Yeah.
There's a Vancouver Coastal Authority put together a really great guideline as well. And actually, there's a really terrific one out of New York called the Hebrew Home, the Riverdale Home. Actually put together very sex positive, very pro-sexuality guidelines. And there's been some really interesting articles about them as well. So
great resources. Bringing it around to something positive. Again, that's really good. What have you noticed about the physical? Because when we started out this discussion, I said, where do people in long-term care have sex? Have you noticed any things about design or like accommodation in terms of the practical points about sex?
I think some homes make an effort to try to allow that privacy space for people when they're looking for it. I think we have a long way to go, though. I think, again, some of these guidelines that I've quoted, they refer back to having that space and place and encouragement. But I think we still have a ways to go with that.
Or another thing I wanted to ask you about is when we talked about the bias that we have sometimes towards heterosexuality and things like that. I've run into a couple of situations where it does come to light that a person's sexual orientation or sexual behavior was really not what was presented externally. That has sort of been presented to me as a doctor as like, what do we do What should we do? And I had a hard time, dealing with that. And I guess my thing was just sort of like, well, your dad is an adult, and just like you had a life separate from your dad had a life separate from you, and just move on. I had to sort of help the family through that. How it ended up being my job, I don't know, Natalie. I need to have you on speed dial. But when those kinds of things have come to your attention, how do you deal with that?
Well, I think what we need to remember, particularly about the current generation of LGBTQ plus elders, is that a lot of them, while it's very common now to be out and open, the people that are in the current generation of elders, it wasn't. And a lot of them spent a lot of time of their life trying to pass as heterosexual. And they spent a lot of their life not being able to be free to express themselves in a public way. It's very common when people go back into care that they go back into the closet because they're worried about the way that they're going to be treated by care providers. They're worried about disclosing something that they've kept secret for so long. They have so many worries, and I think we need to be supportive of that and recognize the fact that they have, it doesn't matter where along the spectrum you fit, and I think generally everybody, very rarely do people fit in truly one sort of side or the other. Everybody sort of fits somewhere along the spectrum, and I think we need to recognize that and be open to the idea that just because someone presents some way in a very public way, their private persona can be completely different. And I think we really need to recognize that.
And there's always going to be things that are private to your grown-up mom or dad that, we're just private. But it's never too late to be your real self.
That's right? Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad, like I say, I'm glad we kind of came back to some positive things about sexuality, because for sure, I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about when sexual expression can be problematic. Most of the time, it's just sexual expression, but it can change with cognitive impairment.
Exactly.
Like it can change with a lot of health concerns.
Exactly.
Well, thanks, Natalie, for coming back to talk to us. So we were just saying this is part 3 of our series on sex and seniors, and we definitely have a lot more to talk about. And this is something that's a real passion for you, right? Talking about sexuality in seniors?
It is, yes. And I'm especially interested in caregivers and what it's like to be a caregiver and also a sexual being. So I would love to have the opportunity to interview any caregivers that would love to sit down and talk to me for about an hour or so and just share their experience about what it is like to balance the needs of themselves as a caregiver and being a sexual person, and what it's also like to be a caregiver.
Excellent. So you're talking about the Caregiver Sexuality Discovery Project. And you mentioned you're looking for participants. You're gathering data, which I think is really valuable, because that's a topic we don't know a lot about.
Exactly.
Is how does being a caregiver affect a person's sexuality? It's very complex and it's really important. So I think that's great that you're doing that. So if anybody wants to talk to you, what should they do?
They can email me at natalie@wiltontherapy.com, or they can connect with me through my website or through my Facebook page.
Excellent. And I've been on that Facebook page and it's looking really sharp. Good job. So if anyone wants to connect with Natalie, it's natalie@wiltontherapy.com, and her website is wiltontherapy.com. She'd be happy to talk to you. She's very easy to talk to. I would recommend anyone who's a caregiver talk to her. So Natalie, thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us today here on The Wrinkle, where you've been listening to part 3 of Sex and Seniors. Today we talked about sex and the changing brain, and our guest was Natalie Wilton, sex therapist and social worker. If you want more Wrinkle, you can find us on Facebook at The Wrinkle 2. You can also join us on Twitter at The Wrinkle 2, or drop us a line at wrinklechat@gmail.com. You can also find all of our videos and podcasts on YouTube. Just search under The Wrinkle. And let us know what you're thinking. There's space to leave comments on Facebook and on YouTube. And we'd love to hear what you'd like to see and what you think of our work. We're open to ideas and we do take requests. Thanks again for joining us. I'm Dr. Nicole Diddick, and I'll see you next time on The Ring.